Here's a brief overview of what we're going to be doing today. First, we're going to be talking about what types of ships are out there, then where they're going, what stressors they cause to the environment, and then the governance that relates to shipping. But before I begin in earnest, I wish to ask you all a question. How many of you have ever eaten a banana? Excellent, that's all of you. But how many of you know where that banana comes from? That's a more complicated question. Don't say trees. But how does the banana get from the tropical jungle where it's grown to your mouth? Well, it comes on you on a ship, much like this one. It is not very cost effective to fly your banana or to drive your banana to your grocery store. Thus, shipping is a very integral part of today's global economy. But just how important is it?
Well, shipping is an important business. It's important and it's big. And the total value of the direct revenue of the shipping industry amounts globally to over 180 billion US dollars a year. It's a big number. It's a pretty abstract number. To give you some idea of the size of that, it's about the same as the value of all goods and services produced in a small European country every year. But shipping is more than its direct revenues. If you include the benefits to coastal communities that rely on shipping, other companies that deliver products to the shipping industry, that number rises to over $430 billion annually. Again, a really big abstract number. How much is that? Well, it's about the same as the gross domestic product with a former European great power. And importantly, shipping connects areas of the world that we've sought to connect for centuries. And many of the planet's most important trade routes pass straight through the Sargasso Sea. We all know that most of our stuff comes from China. And if you're delivering something by ship from the Asian East Coast to the US East Coast to Europe, you will most probably pass through the Sargasso Sea. And in fact, over 40% of global shipping traffic takes place in the North Atlantic, so the Sargasso Sea is a heavily trafficked area. If you draw straight lines through the major ports, you can also figure out roughly where these ships are going, and it's obvious that many of these ships are passing through the Sargasso Sea.
So what types of ships are there? First of all, there's the container ship, which, as its name indicates, carries containers. These containers themselves carry consumer goods such as shoes and rubber ducks from where they are manufactured to where they are consumed. These ships often travel regularly repeating routes between ports, as they often have repeat cargoes. The next type of ship I'm going to talk about is oil tankers. They carry oil and other oil-based products between ports. The number of ports that they go to are fewer than the shipping container ships, as there are less ports that have the facilities to receive the oil tankers' cargo. The oil tankers also move in unpredictable patterns, as they will often change their course on short notice in order to cash in on current market trends. Bulk dry carriers, another aptly named type of ship, carry things such as grain and coal between destinations. These types of ships move in similar patterns to the oil tankers, as they will randomly change their course in order to make the best profit for their voyages. However, they go to a much larger number of ports than oil tankers, as their cargo can be received by a much larger number of ports. Cruise ships carry tourists from place to place. Generally, these places are somewhere that's nice and warm and tropical, like Bermuda, for example, in the Sargasso Sea. Cruise ships are very important to Bermuda, as half of all the tourists that annually arrive on Bermuda come from cruise ships. That's 250,000 people a year. And the tourism industry generates about 28% of Bermuda's gross domestic product. Now, people aren't going to stop using cruise ships to go on nice vacations. People aren't going to stop eating grain. They're not going to stop wearing shoes. We've tried to tell people to stop using oil and coal, but that hasn't worked out as well as we'd like it to. So shipping, therefore, is going to continue to be a very important part of the ocean and continue to be an important part to consider as we make our recommendations.
So with all that you know about maritime traffic, maybe you could tell us where these ships are going. I mean, they're pretty large, right?
Yep.
And
Well,
there are a lot of them, right?
they're in the ocean, all right?
Right, so, so where in the ocean?
I don't know.
Right, and that's pretty much exactly the problem we have when we look at maritime traffic in Sargasso. So we just don't know what these things are, ironically. And although you can draw straight lines on a map between two ports and be reasonably accurate, the shortest route is often the cheapest route, and the cheapest route is often the route taken by shipping companies looking for more money. We don't know the specific details of exactly where the ships are, how many there are, or what types of ships are where. Now there are a few systems you can use to try to track vessels and see where they are more accurately. One of them is the Automatic Identification System, AIS. Originally designed as a collision avoidance system and an international security system that port authorities use to keep track of what ships are in port. It allows ships to talk to each other, allows ports to talk to ships, and it's mandated under the International Maritime Organization, under the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, for collision avoidance purposes. But this data is becoming increasingly global, as opposed to just local, and it's also available online. You can extract this data basically from your home computer and start aggregating it to see where ships are, and construct maps that look something like this. Now these again are straight lines between ports, but it gives you some idea of the volume of traffic that passes through the specific routes. If you want to get away from these straight lines, you can look at other data collection systems, like the Voluntary Observing Ship Scheme, VOS. It's run by NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it's a weather observation program that meteorologists use to verify their forecasts on the ground. It's a voluntary program that mariners, through which mariners can report their weather observations, such as sea state, wind direction and force, and of course their location. So by picking out this little detail from all these weather reports of location, you can construct more accurate maps, such as this heat map. This was published in Science a few years ago. Now, most of you are probably thinking, is Fredrik lying to us? He just said we don't know where these ships are. This map looks pretty solid, right? Well, sort of. Only 11% of eligible ships do participate in the observing ship scheme, so this data is actually pretty sparse. Although it's a lot of data, it doesn't represent all the ships out there. And the data is biased in ways that we don't know as well. Future technologies that we might use that would require more resources, more of a focused effort, etc. to deploy include synthetic aperture radar, used by the military. I should note that all of these data are the ones available for civilian purposes. It might be that someone knows where these ships are. The civilian research community does it. By investing more money in new technologies or the ones already available, we could find out more. So why do we want to know where these ships are? Well, it is important because a large ocean-going vessel does have a number of environmental impacts. Can anyone name an environmental impact that a huge cargo ship might have as it transits the ocean? Well strikes would be one of them, yeah?
Right. Anyone else?
Pollution.
No? Good. I have something to talk about. So, shipping along with fishing is one of the most intensive human uses of the high seas, conducting trade among all jurisdictional boundaries. Despite the fact that we know the impact of shipping practices to the coastal areas, a global assessment of these impacts on the Sargasso Sea has not yet been conducted. When people think about environmental impacts associated with shipping, they think about oil spills, like the Exxon Valdez accident. People don't think about day-to-day operations, which are also highly significant. As the stressors group pointed out, the list of the overall stressors or threats is very long, and all stressors don't impact the environment in the same way. The first question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we choose them? How do we prioritize them? Well, we have to think about about having enough data to understand the impacts they have to the environment. Then we have to pick the ones that are issues of great concern, how urgent they are. And then whether and to what extent they affect us humans by affecting an ecosystem service. The next question we should ask ourselves is, how do we address them once we have chosen them? We have to think about the degree of feasibility. How easy is to implement management practices given the existing governance? We have to think about the time frame we've set. We want to address them in the short term, mid-term, or longer term. And then we have to think about how can we minimize trade-offs? How can we reduce the impacts, the industry's cost by reducing the impacts to the environment? So many of the previous groups have mentioned stressors. However, in this presentation, we're going to focus on the stressors associated to shipping. The first one, air emissions. But the majority of the studies are focused on gas emissions in ports and not on the high seas. Whereas carbon dioxide emissions are approximately 1/5 of those of road transport, shipping produces about 10 times more nitrogen oxide emissions and approximately 80 times more sulfur oxide emissions than aviation flights. These gases are known to contribute to acid rain. The next threats are chemical substances and oil. Chemical substances include hazardous and noxious substances that persist to the environment, and they're either toxic or highly reactive. Some examples, heavy metals, detergents, pesticides, etc. Oil discharges result from engine and cargo tanks of large vessels. If highly concentrated, they have harmful effects to marine organisms. The next one, solid waste. We already talked about plastic debris, their ability to transport harmful organisms and pollutants. Shipping also contributes to sewage, wastewater. Majority, they come from cruise ships that transport a lot of people. If not treated properly, they can also be a significant source of pathogens. In general, waste treatment on board is much less efficient than treatment on shore. The next one, invasive species, primarily transported through ballast water. Ballast water diffuses from tank carriers and liquid tankers. Other disturbances to the marine environment include physical harming on habitats like Sargasso mats and also species like right whales. For example, ship strikes. We know that they occur between vessels and marine organisms like small cetaceans, right whales, and other marine vertebrates. Right whales are receiving particular attention since we now know that they cause 40% of their mortality. Last but not least, acoustic pollution, undersea noise that interferes with various vital functions of marine organisms. They can physically damage marine mammals, and they can interfere with communication signals, and also they can lead to changes in their behavior. So all operational activities are regulated under international law, however, which set limit standards. However, they can be these practices are subject of many violations. This is probably due to the lack of monitoring and also lack of enforcement of these measures.
So we have all these stressors, but what governmental frameworks do we have in place to address them? Well, the main organization is the IMO, or the International Maritime Organization. And under the IMO, there are many restrictions that help restrict pollutants. The main one being Maritime, which has several different annexes under it, which control different pollutants. For example, up here we have Annex 5, which regulates garbage. So each stressor discussed previously by Amalia has its own annex or convention that addresses it and restricts it. But there are some that aren't restricted as well as others, or have few and little restrictions, such as invasive species. This was already previously discussed by Margaret, but I will go over it again. Under the Ballast Water Convention, there are different restrictions for the amount of dumping and where it can be dumped by ship. But the convention is not signed by enough signatories, so it can be not put into action. Another example is ship strikes. Under NOAA, there are special regions where whales are specially monitored to prevent ship strikes, but there are no encompassing annexes or conventions that overall prevent ship strikes. The last one is acoustic pollution. There are actually no regulations or restrictions throughout the whole ocean that restrict acoustic pollution. So, there are other frameworks also under the IMO that help to restrict pollutants, such as this one, MARPOL. It's a MARPOL special area, and it was previously discussed briefly also. In this, under any one of the annexes, a special area can be put into action. For example, in the Baltic Sea, under Annex 6, air emissions are restricted and more intensely than the average ocean. Another framework is particularly sensitive sea areas, which is more encompassing than special areas, and it can include things like places to be avoided. So, as discussed, we have a lot of gaps that we are being addressed by us, but there's still more. In the IMO, implementation or enforcement is not up to them. They leave it up to the different nations, which presents a problem because different nations may have different ways to implement or enforce things. For example, one nation could more strictly enforce oil regulations than another nation. So how do we fill in these gaps? How do we provide closure? And what are our recommendations?
So keeping in mind all the information we just told you on the governance gaps that Olivia just presented, our work group would like to make several recommendations to the signatories of the Hamilton Declaration, as these are nations that have shown an interest in protecting and responsibly using the Sargasso Sea. These recommendations include working with the International Maritime Organization to consolidate shipping traffic into lanes along the already established routes that we have seen on the map before, to minimize the area that does see shipping traffic. We also urge the signatories to work with the IMO to make environmental standards across the board more stringent, more comprehensive, and more well enforced globally. And we also urge the signatories to support further research in such areas as acoustic pollution and its effect on marine mammals, as well as research on maritime traffic location and density, figuring out where these ships are so that we can more effectively manage maritime traffic in the Sargasso Sea. And these are our recommendations for the entire Sargasso Sea area.
We also have some special recommendations for just the western area of the Sargasso Sea. It is the area of the Sargasso Sea that sees the highest human use, and therefore we suggested that the signatories of the Hamiltonian Declaration urge the IMO to make it a special area under MARPOL in order to reduce the amount of things that are dumped overboard and what sort of waste can be released in the Sargasso Sea. We also wish to draw attention to the western tip of the western area, which sees an even higher human use of the area. We recommend further research be put into that area and perhaps it be designated as a particularly sensitive sea area, as it is very close to shore and therefore sees higher use and still has that unique habitat. We also recommend the implementation of a couple of monitoring systems for the area. The first being a voluntary right whale monitoring system. If a ship captain sees a right whale in an area, they would report it into the system, and then other captains in the area would be alerted to the whale's presence and what steps and measures they can take to avoid collisions with the whale, such as slowing down their ship and, if possible, reducing the noise they're putting into the ocean. The second voluntary system would be a Sargasso mat monitoring system. Once again, if a ship captain sees a Sargasso mat, they would report it to the system, and then the system would report it to other ship captains in the area, along with advice on how to avoid breaking up the fragile ecosystem. Thank you very much for your attention, and we now open the floor to questions.
Yeah, great. That's a great talk. A couple things. One, the IMO is, I think, generally thought of as being really sort of environmentally forward-thinking. So it's a good place to target your efforts because it's generally a receptive audience, and they, for a variety of reasons, but they have really gone out of their way to be leaders in a lot of these things you're talking about. My one question was, I'm curious about if there have been any studies documenting the impacts of like a container ship going through a Sargasso mass. Because, I can think of reasons why it would be bad, but I wonder, it's sort of a question of relative impacts. And we know that those maps get broken up by wave action, by a variety of other things, so I'm just curious about the actual impacts and whether there's been work done on that.
Well, there hasn't been as much specific work done it as we'd like. We do know that in recent years, less large Sargasso mats have been viewed by the observing scientists. So we think there might be a reason for that. And the only reason right now we can think of would be that ships would be breaking up the habitat. We also know that it's very hard for creatures in the Sargasso ecosystem to move from one mat to another. So preserving those mats as much as possible would be important.
There is a lack of research, but we're using sort of the precautionary approach when we recommend consolidating traffic into shipping lanes to minimize that area that does see traffic. The idea being to leave large areas sort of untransited as possible.
Go ahead.
So recently, construction started on the Nicaragua Grand Canal, which will be substantially north of the Panama Canal, and which will be capable of carrying larger ships and more ships. Has anybody done any projections on how that will affect shipping traffic through the Sargasso?
Yeah, so we haven't looked into that specifically, but we have looked into the expansion of the Panama Canal, which I presume will have similar impacts. That shouldn't change. So a northward movement of the main canal shouldn't really change the European traffic that much. That would still probably go through about the same areas of the Sargasso Sea. The expansion of the Panama Canal will bring more traffic from the U.S. East Coast, almost certainly. However, if the canal changes location, the canal is being used, that could put them outside the Sargasso Sea and have them go only through the American East area. So, sort of yes and no. It could both increase and decrease ship traffic as we're looking forward into the future. But overall, we are expecting more ship traffic with growth in the global economy, expansion of the Panama Canal. And the one thing that could decrease ship traffic is the opening of the Northwest Passage when the ice north of Canada recedes up towards the pole. And it's hard to take ships through there. The waters aren't great, but without ice.
And models have actually been done on when the Northwest Passage is open enough for the large container ships to travel through. It is usually more economically efficient for American vessels to take that route.
I have a question. We talked a bit about enforcement issues and how would we get ships work with ship compliance for the voluntary reporting system? Or like consolidating shipping lanes. Okay, the question is for a question of enforcement for getting the ships to consolidate the shipping lanes or with the reporting system.
How would we enforce that?
Yeah.
It would be under the IMO, with cooperation with other intergovernmental bodies, like organizations. And for the voluntary system, it's been done within U.S. waters, between the NOAA and the Coast Guard, and ships have to report the fact that they enter these areas so they can get feedback and knowledge about critical habitats of right whales. And what we recommend is the extension of this mandatory system, and we propose to be a voluntary because we're not sure that in high seas there are critical habitats of right whales, for example. So we recommend voluntary reporting so we collect enough data in order to see whether we have to protect these areas for specific species.
For staying in shipping lanes, sort of a classic way to do it, or a way that's been done before, is to not enforce that directly, but instead put forward some safety arguments to make the insurance companies tell the shippers that you have to follow although the shipping lanes might not be put down in the law anywhere, the insurance company will say, we won't insure you unless you follow the shipping lanes. So there are some examples like that closer to shore where the traffic is denser. It's a little easier to make those safety arguments, but that's the way that.
Did you look at some of the issues that are entwined in the issue of the IMO setting very robust global standards, and the fact that all ships have a one-board flag of a certain nation? And that's where a lot of the issues you look at, like air quality and discharge, are really tied to the engineering aspect and the maintenance and improvement and the change over time that the nation that flagged the vessel can raise their standard of what vessel is going to allow to be registered or not registered. And that seems to be where some problems could be resolved when you look at eliminating flags of convenience because the standards are so low that ships are so poorly maintained and operated that they create the problems that you identify. So did you look at how I was trying to think about raising the bar for the management of the vessels as a physical entity that has to float and move?
So some background for those who are not familiar with maritime traffic in general. The largest flag country, the country that has the most ships in the world is Liberia. I think Panama might be second. I mean, not that all ships come from Liberia. There are a lot of what are really American or Danish vessels that are just flagged in Liberia because the regulations are pretty lax.
So we did look into flags of convenience, however, we did not make any recommendations concerning flags of convenience, as this has already been a noted and well-understood problem of the IMO.
So the IMO understands the issues there, and their ability to motivate those nation states to do their job is not sufficient.
And one approach you can take that sort of advocacy organizations often take with multinational companies operating in countries where governance is pretty weak and the laws aren't really enforced, is to go after those multinational companies instead in positive or negative ways and say that look what this company is doing in this country across the world, they're cutting down the rainforest. You can do that same thing with shipping companies and say these guys are doing something bad, or probably better is to, and we have this in our written recommendation proposal too, is to really promote the shipping companies that are doing good things, that are self-imposing stricter air emission standards, that are decreasing their engine noise and all of that stuff. So to do that maybe not in the legal way, but instead working with consumers and the American public, for example, and say, look at this company, they're doing great things. So there are examples. The Green Award is an established award for shipping companies that don't emit as much gas.
And cruise ships in the Caribbean, they're really trying to promote a nice image of environmentally conscious and friendly. So it can be a powerful way to persuade them.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much.